Now to the international dispute over the arrest of an Indian diplomat on visa fraud charges. The attorney for Devyani Khobragade told Arise News on Wednesday that all the charges against her were baseless. Well, last night, the U.S. attorney handling the case, Preet Bharara, who is of Indian descent, by the way, issued an unusual and vigorous defense of the case in a written statement. Ms. Khobragade was charged based on conduct, as is alleged in the complaint, that shows she clearly tried to evade U.S. law designed to protect from exploitation the domestic employees of diplomats and consular officers. There can be no plausible claim that this case was somehow unexpected or an injustice. Indeed, the law is clearly set forth on the State Department website. In fact, the Indian government itself has been aware of this legal issue and that its diplomats and consular officers were at risk of violating the law. Ms. Khobragade is alleged to have treated this victim illegally in numerous ways by paying her far below minimum wage. Ms. Khobragade, as the complaint charges, created a second contract that changed the amount to be paid and deleted required language protecting the victim from other forms of exploitation and abuse. Ms. Khobragade was accorded courtesies well beyond what other defendants, most of whom are American citizens, are accorded. She was not, as has been incorrectly reported, arrested in front of her children. She was not handcuffed or restrained. The arresting officer did not even seize her phone as they normally would have. They offered her the opportunity to make numerous calls to arrange personal matters and contact whomever she needed, including allowing her to arrange for childcare. Because it was cold outside, the agent let her make those calls from their car and even brought her coffee and offered to get her food. It is true that she was fully searched by a female deputy marshal in a private setting when she was brought into the U.S. Marshal's custody, but this is standard practice for every defendant, rich or poor, American or not, in order to make sure that no prisoner keeps anything on his person that can harm anyone, including himself. This is in the interest of everyone's safety. Further, the victim's family reportedly was confronted in numerous ways regarding this case. Speculation about why the family was brought here has been rampant and incorrect. Some focus should perhaps be put on why it was necessary to evacuate the family and what actions were taken in India vis-a-vis them. Khobragade's attorney calls the U.S. attorney's statement muscle flexing and a deliberate attempt to humiliate his client. As for the situation with the housekeeper, we want to get some insight from Tiffany Williams from the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and she's joining us from our Washington bureau. Tiffany, thank you so much for coming on Arise America. I do appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
The first thing I'd like to know, I know that you've been following this case for quite some time. How did it come to your attention?
We actually organize domestic workers all over the country who have developed networks with each other so that when situations like this come up, we're usually alerted, especially in cases where the employer is a diplomat. We do pay special attention to those because of the severity of those cases when they happen.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Why the fact that this involves a diplomat raises a flag for you?
Well, for us, this case is actually not unusual because of the facts of the case, but unusual because it actually got attention. We've actually seen this kind of exploitation across the board in many different places, not just in New York, but also in D.C. And when it involves diplomats, we really worry because they're not often brought out in the media or brought to justice at all.
Of course, we have reported, as it was stated in the complaint, that the house worker was, or the domestic worker was only paid $3.31, what came to be $3.31 per hour. Did that surprise you at all?
Not at all. And you'll note that the reason it was phrased came to be was because she was asked to work many more hours than what she should have been working under her real contract. So it's not unusual that a worker is charged or is paid less than what she should have been paid at all.
Can you tell me, are the concerns of domestic workers in general, not even just in these cases with diplomats, are they taken seriously enough?
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, that's why we're organizing. That's why we're working on this issue. around the world, we have 52 million domestic workers. So it's not just a problem in the U.S., it's a problem everywhere. And domestic workers have rights all across the board, ranging from zero to some, like this protection on this A3 visa, where she did have the right to a fair wage and working conditions and all of the other benefits that she was supposed to have that should have been enforced.
And explain that just a little bit more, Tiffany, because this worker is actually an Indian citizen that was in the U.S. on a work visa. So what access to workers' rights laws does she have being here as a visitor, if you will?
That's right. Actually, she would have more rights than most regular domestic workers, and that is because the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of the U.S. actually mandated the State Department to put into place these kind of protections because of years of abuse of the system, not just by diplomats, but also employees of the World Bank and the IMF. And so they actually required the contracts to be very explicit about what they include in order to protect against the exact same kind of abuse that we're seeing in this case.
Tell me, well, I understand that there's been an aspect of the media attention that this case has gotten that's been troublesome to you. Explain that.
It's been very upsetting, actually, to look at the Indian media in this case. What you would expect is that they would have an outcry of support for the worker who was exploited, but in fact, they have actually turned completely against the domestic worker and even against the U.S. attorney, who, as you mentioned in the intro, is of Indian descent as well. And to us, that represents a sort of a bias against domestic workers that we're seeing everywhere, but the kinds of comments that are very personal and very vicious. And so we're actually organizing to speak out in front of Indian consulates tomorrow across the U.S. to really draw attention to the fact that the Indian government needs to step up and support this worker too.
I would imagine that there are quite a number of countries that do not have laws that protect domestic workers. Is India one of them? And where does India fall in terms of its treatments of these types of workers?
That's right. India is one of them, and in fact there are many more, as you mentioned, that don't have sort of minimal national standards for how domestic workers are treated. But even in the U.S., we're not perfect. Only a few weeks ago or months ago were we granted the right to minimum wage and overtime for certain kinds of domestic workers. So we're all still struggling in the world to really bring up the standards. And the ILO, actually the International Labor Organization, recently passed an international convention that brings up the rights of domestic workers. And India has yet to sign it, nor has the U.S., but other countries have. And so we're hoping that this story will really draw attention to the overall situation facing domestic workers and bring up that ILO convention.
Tiffany, I'm just curious. No one seems to know where this worker is. Do you know? Does your organization know?
Yes, but of course for her privacy and safety safety of her family members, as mentioned by the U.S. Attorney's statement, we are not releasing that information.
All right, we'll leave it right there. Tiffany Williams, thank you so much for your time.